Hi guys, first presentation of spring semester 2018. Um, I hope that you guys listened to what I talked about in class today about why we do these presentations. If you have any suggestions over the course of the semester about what I can do to make them better, I would appreciate it. I'll be happy to listen to it. As of today, we're just going to go along with presentation one, along with the way that it had been done before, except for one major edit at the end, which you will see when we get there. So let's start talking about Reconstruction. The Civil War claimed anywhere, historians estimate from 620,000 to up to 1,000,000 lives, and the conclusion of the Civil War did not end all the issues that led up to it. In fact, it created more. How were the Confederate States going to be treated? As conquered provinces? Were they forgiven prodigal sons, or were they traitors to the United States? The post-Civil War period in the South is known as Reconstruction. In many instances, the Civil War was a final blow to the industrial agrarian conflict that for so long had divided North and South. Now the North was, with its industrial might, gained control of Congress and would no longer be at the mercy of the South. The South had to rebuild their society to conform to the victorious Union's demands. The Emancipation Proclamation had abolished slavery in the South. In the minds of Southern plantation owners, they were losing over $4 billion of assets and revenue. Much of the South had to grudgingly rebuild, but their railroads, their land, and their manpower were severely decimated by the war. The Confederate Army was beaten, but in many ways the South was still unbowed. Many planters now found themselves destitute because they were unable to manage their lands without slaves. As the Union Army was dispatched to take care of the former rebel provinces, they were viewed with hatred as the conquerors that they were. The freemen, or ex-slaves, struggled as well. How would they work to feed their families? They still were treated by many citizens, treated unequally by many citizens in the country. Many argued that land should be provided for them to work. In the end, this plan did not get footing and was not implemented. I'm hoping that after you do this presentation, you'll read in your document booklet the document by Frederick Douglass outlining what black men really wanted. It wasn't necessarily physical things, but more giving them the opportunity to try. In order to help the freedmen adapt to their new lives, Congress created the Freedmen's Bureau, which aimed to provide the basic necessities for ex-slaves as they adjusted. In 1863, President Lincoln issued his plan to return the South to the Union. He argued that they'd never really left the Union, saying that those states were simply out of their proper practical relation to the Union, and the object to get them back into their proper practical relation as quickly as possible. Once 10% of his plan was, once 10% of the Southern voters took an oath of allegiance to the Constitution, they would be allowed to return to the Union. This plan was viewed as being too lenient towards the rebellious South by radical Republicans. When Tennessee, Arkansas, and Louisiana met these guidelines, Congress refused to accept them anyway, stating that Reconstruction was legislative, not an executive function, which is true according to the Constitution, that Congress is able to institute law about how territories admitted to the United States. The Wade-Davis bill, which was sponsored by Senator Benjamin Wade of Ohio, stipulated a different approach to Reconstruction. He said that it not only should have 10% plan, it required that a majority of white male citizens declare their allegiance, and that only those who swore, quote, an ironclad oath that they had always remained loyal to the Union could vote or could serve in state constitutional conventions. The conventions, moreover, would have to abolish slavery, deny political rights to high-ranking civil and military officers of the Confederacy, and had to repudiate Confederate war debts. This was passed in the last days of the 1864 session of Congress. This bill was vetoed by President Lincoln. In retaliation, the Wade-Davis Manifesto was issued, which accused Lincoln of violating his constitutional authority. So you can see that there's a big conflict at the end of President Lincoln's term as president, saying that he thought that he had the idea of what to do to get the South admitted, and Congress said by following the Constitution, which says that Congress has the power to decide how territories enter into the United States, and it was their issue. So it comes to question that if Lincoln had survived, if it really would have been as rosy as everybody thinks that it would, that they think it would have been if Lincoln had survived. Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a Southern sympathizer, on April 14th, 1865. Um, for a little bit of reference, the Appomattox surrender was on April 9th, and Sherman's surrender, the surrender that Sherman took at Fort Sumter was on April 18th. So this all happened all within a week of each other. Other members of Lincoln's cabinet were targeted in this assassination attempt, including Ulysses S. Grant, but all escaped without loss of life. Booth and the other conspirators were convicted and were later hanged. Lincoln's assassination changed the face of Reconstruction. His successor, Andrew Johnson, would not be strong enough to counteract the demands of the radical Republicans in Congress, who believed that the South must pay for leaving the Union. Johnson continued with Lincoln's plan to restore the Southern states with a twist. He was motivated by putting power to the lower class whites in the South, and his racial prejudice continued against the freed slaves. He also believed that, in addition to Lincoln's plan, was that each state must adopt the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery before it was given full rights. Lincoln probably would have approved about that, but the 13th Amendment was passed after Lincoln was killed. The South returned many Confederates to Congress once they were allowed to send representatives. This angered the Republicans, who demanded reform-minded legislators. Many Southern states had enacted black codes designed to limit African American freedoms. The actions of the South after the Civil War swelled the ranks of the radical Republicans as moderates flocked to their camps. The battle over Reconstruction consumed all of 1865, and by the time it ended, the radical Republicans found themselves in the majority in Congress that fell short of the two-thirds vote necessary to override a presidential veto. Johnson used the veto to kill an extension of the Freedmen's Bureau in 1866, stating that it violated the Constitution. In March of 1866, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, which was vetoed as well. However, because of his actions, Andrew Johnson was alienated more and more, because Republicans overrode his veto on the Civil Rights Act after getting a majority, or two-thirds majority, in the Senate after the 1866 election. They also had put forth a revised version of the Freedmen's Bureau, and his approval steadily declined from this point on. Added to the Constitution was, as a way to ensure the constitutionality of the Civil Rights Act, the 14th Amendment applied the same guarantees that a citizen receives from the Bill of Rights as a federal citizen to his status as a state citizen, because this is where they had the whole argument that states had the rights to make laws that the federal government couldn't trump. I hate to use that word, but that's the only word I could think of. As you'll see, the 14th Amendment left some room for interpretation, leaving room for freedmen and women to be treated as second-class citizens, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Johnson received a devastating defeat in the 1866 midterm election. The radical Republicans returned to over a two-thirds majority in both houses of Congress, and they were able to keep the presidential veto in check. They then embarked on a new program designed to limit the power of the president to exert its control over Reconstruction. First, Congress declared any state that had not met previous guidelines to return to the Union as still in rebellion. So they said that any state that if you haven't done the things that we've said so far, you are still in rebellion. So you are still at war with the Union. And second, they denied the power of the president to remove members of his cabinet. We talked about that in class, which was called the Tenure of Office Act. Johnson was fighting with his Secretary of State, who was Edwin Stanton. He removed Stanton, and then he tried to appoint Grant as the Secretary of State, or the Secretary of War. It wasn't Secretary of State, Secretary of War. And the radical Republicans moved to impeach Johnson on the grounds that he had violated the Tenure of Office Act. When he removed Secretary of Stanton from his cabinet, they then passed this law in 1866. He was impeached, or Johnson was impeached, but he fell short of being removed from office by one vote in the Senate. Johnson sought the Democrat nomination in 1868 for his own term as president, but he did not receive it, and Grant handily won the election as the Republican candidate. Now, in order to return to the Union, states had to craft a new constitution, provide universal male suffrage, which means that all males 21 years of age and older could vote, and adopt the 14th Amendment before Congress would consider allowing them to return. Until then, the South would be divided into 5 military districts controlled by governors. But by the end of 1870, which had been 5 years since the end of the Civil War, all of the former Confederate states had met all the conditions for being readmitted, including ratifying the 15th Amendment, which gave all male citizens the right to vote and guaranteed all universal male suffrage. Here's the context of the first clause or Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. It says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state, that should say state, not state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. The 14th Amendment was ratified on July 28, 1828. Though this amendment meant to ensure equal citizenship for all races, its wording left a lot of wiggle room for state interpretation. You can look at it, and as many times it says state in here, it led to the idea that separate but equal was okay. It was okay if the state determined that they could have separate facilities as long as they were of equal quality. It was a type of government that sanctioned segregation. You also might notice that this amendment is a do not for the states, which does not follow suit with the first original 10 amendments, which limit the federal governments, but not the states. So we have a very dramatic shift in how government is executed after the Civil War. Here's actually it's a picture. It's not really a cartoon, but it was drawn about what life was like in the poor and the wealthy. Even divide with between the blacks. You can see down here in the right-hand corner, we've got the poor blacks who are just kind of messing around on the ground. And the rights of the 15th Amendment said that anybody could vote, but you can look at this and see that I'm going to backtrack for just a second. I'm sorry, I got distracted. There was a football game going on, and Georgia's winning, so it distracted me a little bit. Anyway, you can see how it's very difficult for the blacks to get to vote. Down here in the bottom right corner, we've got kids playing in the street. They were registering to vote and voting in large numbers in 1870. However, as segregation becomes an even more prolific practice in the South, the voting rights of the blacks actually completely disappears until the 1960s. The freedmen, as the newly freed slaves were called, did not find equality, even though they were no longer bound to their masters. In some ways, life became a little worse. Church became the center of freedmen's society. By 1890, over 1.3 million African Americans in the South proclaimed themselves to be Baptist due to the decentralized structure of the church. Marriage, which under slavery had been illegal, exploded, with the majority of former slave families by 1870 living in a two-parent home. Communities also worked to establish schools to educate the freedmen. They faced pressure from oppressive citizens trying to claim superiority over the newly freed slaves and women. The constitutional conventions of each state demanded of the states by Congress that they be populated by several hundred freedmen. A power struggle between the rural and urban freedmen developed over issues pertaining to the redistribution of the land. And many urban black elites argued against the leveling of the social classes. So the rich black people didn't want to be on equal footing with the poor black people, just like the poor white people didn't want to be on equal footing as the rich white people. The urban black elites argued that they didn't want the social classes to be leveled because they didn't want to allow the uneducated to be on par with the educated. This led to many ex-slaves being treated like second-class citizens, receiving claim to public funds and public funds, but on kind of a much smaller scale than it happened a little bit later. During Reconstruction, any person who had a role in aiding the Confederacy was barred from holding a position in the government. Therefore, those who held positions were mostly in two categories. Number one, they were Southerners who betrayed their roots and sided with the Union during the war, and they were during the war and after the war. They're known as scalawags. And then there were the Northerners who immigrated to the South to take a position Northerners could not hold, and they were called carpetbaggers. Many of the constitutions that were forced on the South during Reconstruction would remain after the era ended, and they were spearheaded oftentimes by carpetbaggers, and many of the provisions founded therein would be adopted into new ones. Religion played a large role in the development of Reconstruction. Many of the denominations before the Civil War had split into northern and southern factions, and after the war, they struggled to consolidate their members. For most freedmen, the Civil War was a gift from God, like we explained about they would take him to church when they saw the Yankee leaders. It was veritable proof that God cared for them and was looking after their best interests. Although he had never held elected office before, Ulysses S. Grant, the former commanding general of the Northern forces during the Civil War, was elected President of the United States in 1868, based mainly on his victory during the Civil War. At 46, he was the youngest president to be elected up to that time. He was also a little bit gullible, and would trust some of the wrong people, as we're going to see as this era progresses and as we talk about President Grant in class on Wednesday. After the war, the United States had a $432 million $1 million worth of debt of greenbacks that were to be paid back with hard money. So greenbacks are paper money, and they were demanded to be paid back with gold or silver. This is actually, the word is specie when you're talking about hard money, gold or silver. Once done, paper money would be abolished. Once it had all been paid back, this greenback debt, paper money would be abolished and a return to the gold or silver standard, specie, would occur. Democrats advocated printing more money to pay off that debt. Grant's administration faced a series of scandals that were some of them were based on this gold and silver standard, many due to the quality of people he put in office. Scandals during this time included a plot to corner the gold market, the credit mobilier scandal, and the whiskey ring. We'll talk about those in class. All of these would be traced back to either family that he had put in place to work with him or close workers of Grant who were criminals, and it kind of marked his presidency. Groups opposed to Reconstruction of the South and the elevation of freedmen soon appeared after the war ended. The most infamous of these groups was the Ku Klux Klan, also known as the KKK, a white supremacist group dedicated to wiping out those that they viewed as dangerous to the South. They would wipe out freedmen, carpetbaggers, and scalawags. To counteract these groups, Congress passed 3 enforcement acts designed to protect black voters, but they didn't work. This political cartoon, which was drawn by one of the most famous cartoonists of the time, whose name was Thomas Nast, illustrates the Ku Klux Klan, and on the left you'll see a little sign that says the White League, which was another organization like the KKK, promoting conditions worse than slavery for Southern blacks after the Civil War. You can see how they're being treated so poorly. They don't have any money to their name, and the white supremacists are holding this power over their heads because they are black. The heavy-handedness of radical Republicans and the scandals of the Grant administration spawned the creation by 1872 of a new faction of the Republican Party, that of the Liberal Republican. The Democrats supported the Liberal Republicans nominee Horace Greeley for president in 1872. However, U.S. Grant won the election. In the Deep South, a lot of politics going on down there. The KKK played an instrumental role in determining the outcome of elections. As events outside the South drew the attention of Northerners away from the area, freedmen found themselves drifting away from the civil rights that they had been granted, and they were being taken over, and they were mostly intimidated or scared into not voting. Republican control of the former Confederacy dwindled as Democrats began to reclaim their offices and their governments. The withdrawal of the greenback, the printed money from circulation, and the overextension of railway lines beyond profitable means, and the failure of a prominent bank caused a loss of confidence in the economy, and it started to panic. So there were way too many. The railroads were overbuilt. They didn't have the supply to keep them moving all of the time. This issue with the money and trying to go back to specie and a failure of a big bank started a panic going around. And this was a depression that lasted for 6 years. This was during the Grant administration and on into the Rutherford B. Hayes administration. The Republicans, being the party in power, were given the blame for the depression, which boosted the Democrats' image. And in 1874, the Democrats took control of the House of Representatives. At the time, some greenbacks were still in circulation and traded lower than gold. But when Grant demanded greenbacks to be redeemed for the same value in gold, it shook the economy again and the depression continued, which is difficult because he kept trying to fix it, and he was so inexperienced with that kind of thing and wouldn't listen to people who were more experienced that he couldn't improve the situation. The only thing that makes printed money worth anything is the confidence that it can be redeemed for something of value. And so this vicious cycle lowered the value of money again and again. In 1876, the Republicans nominated Rutherford B. Hayes for president, and the Democrats nominated Samuel Tilden. When the electoral returns were announced, the popular vote swayed for Tilden, but the Electoral College went to Hayes. The outcome was uncertain, with fraud and intimidation occurring on both sides. The Constitution offered no guidance on this issue, and it had never happened before that they would be so close on the Electoral College, and that the vote was in dispute. They didn't really know who the winner was. The final results ended with 185 electoral votes for Hayes and 184 for Tilden. It is the closest electoral election in history. Finally, Congress established an electoral commission to canvass the results, and they determined that Hayes actually was the winner. A secret deal had actually happened with Democrats later that they would go along with Hayes as president. So the Democrats behind the scenes agreed that they would throw a couple of their electoral votes towards Hayes if he withdrew every federal soldier from the South. So Hayes stuck to that agreement, and when he became president, was he inaugurated in 1877, he pulled all federal troops out of the South, and it was called the Compromise of 1877. And from these areas, the Republican governments that existed would soon fall. So there would be no more Republican control of the governments. This marks the formal end of Reconstruction. That's how we can say that Reconstruction ended in 1877, because it's marked by the pulling out of those troops. This cartoon, which was also drawn by Thomas Nast, shows how horribly vicious this election was. It represents the compromise between the Republicans and the Southern Democrats that ended Reconstruction and the rule of the radical Republicans. You say they're either going to, if they kept Tilden, there would be more killing, or they wanted to keep Tilden. They wanted to have Tilden be the one who was the president. If they didn't put Tilden in as president, who was the Democrat, then there was going to be killing. However, they made this deal, and it ended up turning out for the Republicans. Here is a map of the states being reconstructed in the South and the dates that they ended up coming into the Union. The date in black is when they established control and having their own constitution and being back as their own state, so they could be readmitted to the Union before they had put all of their government back in place. They still had to approve the 13th Amendment. They still had to make sure all of their officers were okay, or met the standards of having not fought for the Confederacy and whatever. But like I said in class in 1868, Andrew Johnson Blanket pardoned all of them, so that became a little bit less of an issue at that point. Anyway, you can see that the states came in a little bit at a time. The interesting thing is that the Deep South didn't establish control of their own government until much later. And by 1877, Florida and Louisiana, which are the last ones, got their governments back and did not have military governors appointed to take care of them anymore. Now, for the rest of the semester, we talked about in class today that how to improve the presentations. So Dalen Stapley raised his hand and he said, can we just not have any assignments on the presentations this semester? And I agreed. We're not going to have any assignments on the presentations this semester, so you can thank Dalen when you see him. But I do want you to continue to think about the questions I asked in class for the class assignment that you're going to handle next time. And that is, was the South conquered territory, or had they just returned from having, had they never really left? And the third question was, what do we do with all of these freed slaves? And we're going to talk about a lot of that in class. The notes that I gave you today are just a tip of the iceberg on the information that you need for that. So I will see you guys in class, and have a good night.